Hello and welcome to this tutorial video, where today I'll be showing you how to paint the dramatically named Flesh Eater Court's Abhorrent Archregent. Today's video is a little longer than usual, as this is a character model, and so I'm going to be spending a little bit more time on the details, as well as using some more advanced techniques like glaze transitions and true metallic metal effects. Also, apologies in advance for the injury on my hand, but it just seems appropriate for this model. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started. I've assembled and primed the model with Wraithbone, because the skin of this model is going to be pale green, and so this gives a nice warm tone to work up from, rather than a cold white. But I'm actually going to begin by painting the rock, as this is going to involve lots of washing and dry brushing, and be the messiest part of the model to paint. With a large brush, I'm going to paint Dawnstone all over the rock to begin. This may take several coats for an even finish, but let each dry before applying the next, and be careful where the figure is holding the rock. Now that's done, and it ended up taking me 3 layers, but you can see I have a smooth and even base coat to work from. I'm now going to wash the stone, for which I need 3 paints: Athonian Camoshade, Plaguebearer Flesh, and Creed Camo. I'll need all 3 at the same time, so I'm going to put a good amount of all 3 next to each other on my palette, like so. First, I'm going to wash the stone heavily all over with Athonian Camoshade, making sure to get it into all the nooks and crannies. I'm being quite heavy here, because I want the paint to stay quite wet for a long time for the next steps. Which is to take the other paints and splodge them randomly over the surface like so, starting with Plaguebearer Flesh. Because the first wash is still wet, the paints are going to meld together as they dry, and create a really nice, mossy, weathered appearance. And then the same thing continuing with Creed Camo. I'm not even washing my brush between paints, allowing them to mix and merge. It may look quite stark now, but this will become a lot subtler when the paint is dry, and will bring everything together with some dry brushing. And now it's dry, you can see what I mean. The stone has been coloured, and there's some interesting variation, but it's become more subtle as it's dried. To re-establish some of the base stone colour, I'm next going to dry brush Dawnstone all over the raised areas, beginning to pick back out the details, but leaving the majority shaded. And then a lighter dry brush with Grey Seer, just to emphasise the very most raised edges and details. You can see what an interesting stone this leaves us with a grey top colour contrasted with some interesting varied green tones underneath. You can leave the stone here, but if you want to redefine some of the pitted areas, you can just take some Creed Camo diluted with equal parts Contrast Medium, and run it back into select cracks and crevices, anywhere you want the green tones to be a bit stronger. I'm also going to use this on the bottom of the flatter areas, to create the effects of moss and rain having built up over years. You can do as many layers of this as you want to push the definition further, and this is quite a fluid process where you can go back and forth between dry brushing and reshading. There's no correct amount here. So just go around like so, touching up anywhere you want. And with that done, our stone is finished. You can see how I've done a few layers of the Creed Camo, just to build up that mossy weathering at the base. I'm really happy with how this looks, and I'm now going to turn my attention to the next part of the model, the skin. As I said, I want a sickly green flesh tone for this model, so I'm beginning with a base coat of Ionrach Skin, applying this over anywhere that's exposed flesh. I'm painting the flesh of the arms here, but not the wing membranes, as I'll be painting these a different colour. Again, just apply as many layers as you need for a smooth finish, and I'll come back to you when that's done. Next, I'm going to shade the skin all over with a 1-to-1 mix of Militarum Green and Contrast Medium, applying this all over the skin like so. Work all over the model, covering one area completely before moving on to the next, and trying not to go back over areas you've already shaded. Once that's had a good while to dry, the skin is ready to start highlighting. I'm going to take Ogryn Camo and layer this over the skin, leaving the recesses shaded. This is going to start building up brightness, but also smooth out the flatter areas where the previous step might have left a slightly patchy finish, giving us a smooth layer to build up further highlights from. This is also quite a useful step because you get a sense of the model and can start identifying where the major muscles to highlight are. For the next highlight, I'm applying a 1-to-1 mix of Ogryn Camo and Ionrach Skin, leaving a little of the previous layer visible, and also beginning to define some of the larger muscles through the direction of my brush strokes. This isn't quite an edge highlight yet, I'm still covering the majority of the model, but this layer is going to start picking out muscle fibres and making the shapes more defined. Next, with pure Ionrach Skin, I'm going to start edge highlighting to define the edges of the muscles like so. I'm very much starting to pick out where the most prominent areas are. You can see here on the shoulder, for example, how I'm using the direction of my brush strokes to again start creating the effect of tensed muscle fibres. This layer is a lot more targeted than the previous. This final step will really make the muscles pop, and allow you to decide where the eye should be drawn. You could of course leave it here, but I think the skin is a little flat at the moment, so I want to add some more colour and life to it. With a 2-to-1 mix of Lahmian Medium and Magos Purple, I'm going to start glazing thinly over areas like the eye sockets, inside the ears, but also the spine, where spikes are growing out of the skin and it's raw and ragged, pushing the colour up to where the skin is torn. I'm using Lahmian Medium even though Magos Purple is a contrast paint, because I want this to behave more like a glaze. The first application is quite subtle because it's a glaze, so I'm using the first pass just to establish where I want the colour, and then a second pass covering a slightly smaller area, but building up the colour further. Anywhere where the muscles are deeper too, you can just use this to add some more colour and interest to the skin. With that done, you can see how I've added some colour to the knees and the face, but also how I've built up several layers on the back to emphasise the torn and ragged skin. The skin is now done, and I'm going to move on to the facial features, starting with the tongue, covering this with Evil Sunz Scarlet. I'm also going to use this colour, a very fine brush and steady hand, to paint the eyeballs. And then spot highlight the tongue with Wild Rider Red. I'm going to base coat the teeth with Dryad Bark. I'm also going to use this to base coat the spines erupting from the back of the model. For the spines, I'm going to take Steel Legion Drab and cover most of the surface, leaving some Dryad Bark towards the bottom and in the deepest cracks. Next, with Balor Brown, I'm going to do the same thing, covering a slightly smaller area and working further up the spines to leave some Steel Legion drab visible. I'm also going to use this to pick out the individual teeth. And then even finer highlights on the spines with Wraithbone, focusing towards the very tips. And finally, with White Scar, I'm going to pick out the very edges of the spines. And also the edges of the teeth, leaving some Balor Brown visible at their bases. I'm next going to paint the claws on the hands and feet, and the tendons between the wing membranes. I'm going to start by tidying up anywhere I painted over in previous steps with Wraithbone. Then, I'm going to cover all of these areas with black Templar contrast paint. It doesn't matter if you get it onto the wing membranes themselves at this point. When that's dry, I'm going to paint Eshin Grey over the claws like so, leaving some black Templar visible towards the base. Then, with Dawnstone, I'm going to apply smaller highlights. You can see on this claw, for example, where I'm beginning to build up the shape of the curve. I'm also going to do the same on this one here. When it comes to these longer claws on the hands, I can use the side of my brush to pick out the top like so. On the hand claws, because these are slightly larger, I'm going to apply an intermediate highlight of equal parts Dawnstone and Grey Seer, applied similarly to the spines on the back, emphasising the curve a little more but building up highlights more gradually. And finally, a dot highlight of Grey Seer on the highest points of the claws, and the ends of the fingernails. This will make them seem shiny and sharp. Now is a really good time to mention that if you're enjoying this video, do please like and subscribe to keep up to date with more painting videos just like this one. For the matted hair across the body, I'm base coating with a 1-to-1 mix of Dawnstone and Dryad Bark. The first highlight for this is Dawnstone, overbrushed to catch most of the hair and leaving the recesses shaded with the base coat. Then, thinner lines with an equal parts mix of Dawnstone and Grey Seer, emphasising individual strands of hair. And finally, spot highlights with grey Seer on the very ends of the strands. For the wing membranes, I'm base coating them with Flayed One Flesh, being careful not to get this where I've already painted. As well as the major membranes, there are also some smaller ones on the backs of the arms. To shade these wings, I'm going to do a series of thin glazes, building up a transition from lighter to darker skin. The first step is Kislev Flesh, thinned to a glaze consistency with 2 parts Lahmian Medium, and I'm going to pick a point on the membranes, and from there start applying it upwards towards the arm like so. You can apply multiple layers if you want to build a stronger colour. Because of the medium, this is a very thin layer, but if you think where the colours join is too stark, you can always apply a thinned layer of Flayed One Flesh at the transition area, just to smooth out the join. Next, the same process, but this time with Kislev Flesh and Bugmans Glow, thinned the same way and applied slightly further up the arm to start building a gradient. And then, with pure Bugmans Glow, covering an even smaller area. With each step you can again apply a very thin layer of the previous colour at the transition area, if you think the join between colours isn't smooth enough. Penultimately, a 1-to-1 mix of Bugmans Glow and Doombull Brown. You can see how I'm working very much towards the top now. And finally, pure Doombull Brown, right at the very top. Then, with Pallid Witch Flesh thinned with medium in exactly the same way, I can turn to the other end of the membrane and build up a gradient in the same way to brighten the area. With Doombull Brown, I'm then going to take a very fine brush and just run this paint into where the arm meets the membrane, almost like panel lining to help define them. I can also take this and paint some very thin veins, concentrating towards the upper portions of the membrane like so. This is entirely optional, but just adds a bit more visual interest. And finally, I'm going to take undiluted Pallid Witch Flesh and just edge highlight the membranes. And there we go, the wing membranes are done. For the Flayed Flesh tabard, my base coat is a 1-to-1 mix of Kislev Flesh and Flayed One Flesh. I'm going to paint this slightly differently to the wing membranes, even though they start from a similar base tone. I'm then going to wash all over the tabard with Reichland Flesh Shade, making sure to get all the trickier bits behind the model. Then, with Carroburg Crimson, I'm going to further shade the deeper folds and anywhere I want the shading to be a little bit stronger. For the first highlight, I'm going to re-establish the base colour on the higher areas of the skin. And then I'm applying finer edge highlights with pure Flayed One Flesh to emphasise the highest points and folds and the tattered edges of the flesh. I'm going to paint the metals on this model in two styles. For the shoulder guard, I want a worn ancient bronze, beginning with a base coat of Sycorax bronze. I'm also going to paint the sword hilt in the same way. Then I'm going to shade the bronze all over with Guiliman Flesh contrast paint. Once that's dry, I'm going to apply a second layer, further defining and emphasising the flatter panels and suggesting the appearance of a light source hitting the upper edges. With Fyreslayer Flesh, I'm going to do a selective recess shade to really bring out the joins between the panels and areas where the metal has been beaten and dented. And finally, I'm edge highlighting everything with Canoptek Alloy to bring back some shine to the bronze. Any bones get a layer of Skeleton Horde contrast paint. On this model, that's the skulls, but also the bones hanging around the neck. I'm then re-establishing the Wraithbone base coat, picking out the higher areas and leaving the recesses shaded. before applying a finer edge highlight with Pallid Witch Flesh, leaving some of the previous highlight visible and concentrating especially on the facial details. And finally a spot highlight with white scar on the very tips. And I'm also going to use this to pick out the individual teeth. For the rope around the neck, I'm going to very carefully paint this in with wildwood, trying desperately not to overspill. The other metal areas, the spike through the chest, the sword blade and the chains, get a base coat of Iron Hand steel. These are going to be rusty steel rather than bronze. I'm then shading these all with a 1:2 mix of Garagak Sewer and Contrast Medium. If you've watched any of my videos before, you'll know I love this paint for creating an old, oily steel. On the sword blade, I'm going to then further apply a second layer of this to create something of a true metallic metal effect, painting the lower half of one side and then the upper half of the other. With heavily diluted Scrag Brown, I can wash this into the recesses like I've done on the chain loops here to simulate rust. And finally, all of the steel gets an edge highlight of Stormhost Silver to pick out the edges. And once you've done that, the model is almost done. The very last thing to paint is the leather straps dotted around the model, such as the one across the chest, holding the skull in place, and also the one tying the sword to the model's waist. I'm going to just pick these out with Abaddon Black, and then edge highlight them with Dawnstone. before spot highlighting any extreme points and edges with grey Seer. And with that done, the model is finished and just needs basing. I haven't yet painted the rat on the base, because I'm about to apply texture paint, and will therefore paint this in when it's done, using the techniques for black and flesh colours I demonstrated earlier in this video. I'm going to give this model a snowy, wintry base, and if you're interested in seeing how I did that, you can watch my previous video on this here. One thing I'm also going to do with this model is apply snow to the top of the rock, thinking of where it would naturally fall and lie, to tie this into the base a little and make the scene a little more natural and cohesive. And there we are. I really hope you enjoyed this video and it's inspired you to paint your own Flesh Eater Courts models, or has maybe shown you something new. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, it really does help this channel grow. And let me know in the comments below if there's something you'd like to see next. Or maybe even consider becoming a member, where you'll get early access to all of my upcoming videos, as well as exclusive, members-only shorts and bespoke tutorials. In any case, I'll see you next time, and until then, happy painting.